Truth is like mercury. It is fluid, hard to hold on to, but reflects everything with chilling, perfect clarity. Experience the changing nature of reality in our latest high-tech cinematic thrillers. Subscribe now and follow the flow of the truth as it reveals itself to the world today.
They didn't fire me for stealing. They didn't fire me for misconduct. They fired me because the owner's son-in-law needed a title that sounded impressive on his LinkedIn profile. 22 years, that's how long I gave that company. And it ended in a Tuesday afternoon meeting that lasted 11 minutes. Let me back up. My name is Daniel. I spent over 2 decades in commercial real estate development, specifically in project finance and client relations. I wasn't the guy who shook hands at charity galas. I was the guy who actually read the 200-page development agreements at midnight, who knew every clause in every contract we'd ever signed with our institutional clients, who personally called our top accounts on their birthdays because I genuinely remembered. I built relationships the old-fashioned way, by showing up, knowing my stuff, and never once letting a client feel like they were talking to someone who was just going through the motions. When I started at Hargrove Capital Group back in the early 2000s, there were 11 people in the office. By the time I was asked to leave, there were over 90. I had personally brought in or retained 19 of our 31 major institutional accounts. I managed a portfolio that represented roughly 60% of the firm's annual revenue. I wasn't just an employee, I was, for all practical purposes, the connective tissue of that organization. But none of that mattered on a Tuesday in March. The owner, a man I'll call Mr. Hargrove, had been slowly stepping back from daily operations for about 2 years. He was in his late 60s, dealing with some health issues, and everyone understood he was transitioning toward retirement. That was fine. That was natural. What nobody saw coming, or at least what I told myself nobody saw coming, was who he chose to hand the wheel to. His daughter had married a man named Bryce about 3 years prior. Bryce had an MBA from a mid-tier program, a very confident handshake, and approximately 18 months of experience working at a boutique advisory firm where, from what I could gather, he mostly sat in on meetings and forwarded emails. He was 34 years old, he wore slim-fit suits that cost more than my first car, and he had absolutely no idea how commercial real estate development finance actually worked. I want to be fair here. When Bryce first started coming around the office, I gave him every benefit of the doubt. I answered his questions patiently. I explained deal structures, walked him through client histories, introduced him to people. I spent probably 40 hours of my own time over 6 months just orienting him to how the business operated. I thought that's what you do. I thought I was helping build something that would outlast all of us. I was wrong about what I was building. About 8 months before that Tuesday meeting, Bryce was given the title of co-managing director. It was presented as a transition arrangement. Mr. Hargrove assured me privately that my role was secure, that Bryce was there to learn, and that the institutional relationships I managed would remain under my supervision. He looked me in the eye when he said it. I believed him. What actually happened over those 8 months was something I've since heard described by a friend of mine who spent 30 years in organizational psychology. He called it a credential transfer. Bryce started sitting in on every client call I ran. He started signing correspondence that I'd drafted. He started attending the lunches and the quarterly reviews not to learn, but to position himself as the primary contact. Slowly, quietly, my name started disappearing from things. I noticed it. I mentioned it once to Mr. Hargrove. He told me I was being sensitive. I told myself he was probably right. Then came that Tuesday. My assistant told me at 2:15 that Bryce wanted to see me in the corner conference room. Not Mr. Hargrove. Bryce. I walked in and there were 2 people with him. The firm's HR director, a woman who had the practiced expression of someone who has delivered bad news so many times it no longer registers, and a man I didn't recognize who turned out to be an outside employment attorney. There was a manila folder on the table. Bryce didn't stand up when I walked in. He said, and I am reconstructing this as accurately as I can, "Daniel, we've made a strategic decision to restructure the senior leadership team. Your position is being eliminated effective today. This packet outlines your separation terms." That was it. No preamble. No acknowledgement of 22 years. He slid that folder across the table the way you'd slide a check to a valet. I sat down. I opened the folder. I am a deliberate person by nature. I don't react before I understand what I'm looking at. The separation package was 30 days of severance for 22 years of service. 30 days. There was also a non-disparagement agreement, a non-solicitation clause covering all current clients for 24 months, and a non-compete that would have prevented me from working in commercial real estate finance within a 200-mile radius for 18 months. I looked up at Bryce. I said, "Who prepared these documents?" The outside attorney said he had. I said, Has Mr. Hargrove reviewed them? Bryce said Mr. Hargrove was aware of the decision. I noticed he didn't answer my actual question. I closed the folder and set it back on the table. Here is what was running through my head in that moment. My son Marcus was a junior at University of Michigan. His tuition payment for the spring semester was due in 6 weeks. My mortgage, my mother, who I helped support financially since my father passed 4 years ago. 22 years of assuming that loyalty was a two-way contract. The particular humiliation of sitting across from a 34-year-old man who had learned everything he knew about this business from me, being told that my position had been eliminated. And underneath all of that, one very clear, very quiet thought. If I sign that non-solicitation agreement, I cannot speak to any of my clients for 2 years. My clients, the people I had built relationships with over 2 decades. People who called me when their deals fell apart, not the firm's main line. People who had my cell phone number and used it. People who trusted me specifically, not Hargrove Capital Group generally. I asked the HR director how long I had to sign. She said they'd prefer I sign today. She said it was standard procedure. I said, I'm going to need my attorney to review this before I sign anything. Bryce's expression shifted. Not dramatically, he had the affect of someone who'd been coached to stay neutral, but something moved behind his eyes. He said, Daniel, the severance offer is contingent on signing today. If you choose not to sign, the offer reverts to statutory minimums. Statutory minimums in my state, for the record, would have amounted to about 2 weeks' pay. I want to tell you I made this decision coolly and logically. The truth is, my hands were flat on the table because I didn't trust them to stay still if I lifted them. 22 years of my life was being priced at 30 days of severance, conditioned on my agreeing to silence myself and stay away from every professional relationship I'd built. I picked up the folder. I stood up. I said, I'll be in touch through my attorney. And I walked out. My office was on the 4th floor. I took the stairs because I didn't want to wait for the elevator. I sat at my desk for about 10 minutes, doing nothing, just looking at the framed photo on my credenza, me and Marcus at his high school graduation, both of us squinting into the sun. Then I packed the personal items from my desk into a canvas bag I kept for grocery runs. My assistant was at her desk outside. She looked at me. I told her it had been a genuine privilege working with her. She started to cry. I told her not to. I drove home. I called my attorney on the way. He told me not to sign anything and to let him handle the communications. I told him I had no intention of signing anything. That night I slept about 3 hours. In the morning I made coffee and sat at my kitchen table and thought about what I actually had, not what I'd lost. What I had. 22 years of relationships, institutional knowledge of 31 active accounts, a reputation that had never once been questioned in over 2 decades, and no agreement restricting my movements. I was not going to call my clients. That felt wrong to me, not legally, since I hadn't signed anything, but ethically. These were professional relationships, not personal ones, and I wasn't going to use them as a landing pad the moment I was out the door. I made a decision to let the dust settle, get my legal situation clarified, and then figure out my next step. What I did not anticipate was that they were going to call me. The first call came 4 days after I left. It was from the CFO of a regional healthcare development group, I'll call him Tom, who had been one of our accounts for 11 years. Tom had my cell number because I had given it to him during a particularly complicated refinancing 3 years prior when things were moving fast and he needed to be able to reach me directly. Tom said, Daniel, I heard you're no longer at Hargrove. I want to understand what's happening. I told him I had separated from the firm and that I wasn't in a position to discuss the details. Tom said, Are you going to be working in this space? I said I was exploring my options. Tom said, I need you to know that our relationship has been with you, not with the firm. Whatever you decide to do next, I want us to have a conversation before we make any decisions on our end. I thanked him and told him I would be in touch once I had clarity on my situation. Over the next 10 days, I received 15 similar calls. Not because I'd contacted anyone. Not because I'd sent any communications. Word had gotten out the way it always does in a specialized industry where everyone knows everyone that I had left Hargrove Capital Group, and the people I'd worked with for years were picking up the phone. My attorney confirmed that since I had not signed the non-solicitation agreement, I was free to respond to inbound inquiries, to discuss my plans, and to establish my own practice if I chose to do so. The only caveat was that I could not actively solicit clients while any potential wrongful termination dispute was ongoing. And since Bryce's team had not paid out even the reduced statutory severance at that point, there was a dispute. I filed a wage claim. My attorney sent a letter. Hargrove Capital Group's outside attorney responded within 48 hours with an offer that was, let's say, considerably more than the original 30 days. I won't give you the exact number, It was enough to cover Marcus's tuition, cover my mortgage for a year, and give me the runway to set up properly. I incorporated Jordan Consulting Group. I used my middle name Jordan because I liked the way it sounded as a business name 11 weeks after walking out of that conference room. I had, at that point, been in contact with 22 of Hargrove's 31 institutional accounts. I was not going to take all of them. Some of them had strong reasons to stay with an established firm. Some of them had existing contracts that weren't up for renewal. Some of them I simply felt it would be inappropriate to pursue given the circumstances. In the end, 14 clients formally signed engagement agreements with Jordan Consulting Group in the first 6 months. Not 22. 14. I want to be accurate about this because I think the temptation in telling a story like this is to inflate the numbers and make everything sound more dramatic than it was. 14 was enough. 14 institutional accounts from a standing start was, by any objective measure, a remarkable beginning for a new firm. What happened at Hargrove Capital Group during those months was something I only know about secondhand, through mutual contacts and, eventually, through industry publications that covered it more bluntly than anyone inside the firm probably would have liked. Bryce had moved quickly after I left to consolidate his authority. He brought in 2 people from his previous firm, people with advisory backgrounds, but no experience in development finance specifically. He restructured several client relationships in ways that, from what I heard, the clients found disorienting. The personal attention that had characterized the firm's service model, the thing I had spent 2 decades building, started to erode almost immediately. There was also, apparently, a significant issue with documentation. Several client accounts that I had managed had complex ongoing arrangements, the kind that lived, not just in formal contracts, but in institutional memory, in the nuanced understanding of what a particular client needed and why. When I left, that memory went with me. Nobody had thought to ask me to do a proper knowledge transfer, probably because nobody had imagined I'd actually walk out without signing the non-solicitation. I heard from one of my former colleagues, a project manager who stayed on, and eventually left of her own accord about a year later, that Bryce had tried to use some kind of AI-assisted system to manage client communications and project tracking. She described watching a client call fall apart because the system had generated a summary that mischaracterized the status of an active deal, and Bryce hadn't known enough about the underlying transaction to catch the error before it reached the client. It wasn't malicious. It was just incompetence. And incompetence at that level of complexity has real consequences. By the end of the first year after my departure, Hargrove Capital Group had lost a significant portion of its major account revenue. Mr. Hargrove, from what I understand, had become aware of the situation and had some difficult conversations with Bryce. There were rumors of restructuring, of bringing in outside management. The firm didn't collapse overnight. Established firms rarely do, but it contracted sharply and painfully in a way that was visible to anyone in the industry who was paying attention. I want to say something here that I mean sincerely. I did not feel satisfaction about this. I want to be careful about that, because I think there's a version of this story that is deeply satisfying in a revenge narrative sense, and I understand why people find that compelling. But sitting in my office, a real office now, with a small team and a growing client list, watching a firm that I had dedicated 22 years to struggle and contract, what I actually felt was something closer to grief. Grief for the institution Mr. Hargrove had built before his son-in-law got his hands on it. Grief for the colleagues I genuinely liked who were caught in the fallout. What I did not feel was regret about walking out of that conference room without signing. That decision, the decision not to sign, was the thing everything else turned on. Not the clients who called. Not the consulting firm, not any of it. If I had signed that non-solicitation agreement, I would have spent 24 months on the sidelines while the professional relationships I'd spent 22 years building were handed off to people who didn't understand them. I would have had 30 days of severance and a very clean LinkedIn profile and almost nothing else. The pressure to sign in that room was real. The financial stakes were real. Bryce knew what he was doing when he structured it as a same-day decision. He was betting that I would do the math on 30 days versus 0 and take what was on the table. What he didn't account for was that I had 22 years of experience reading deals, and I knew a bad one when I saw it. I've thought a lot since then about what the real lesson is here. Because I don't think it's simply don't sign the NDA. Sometimes there are very good reasons to sign separation agreements. Sometimes the compensation attached to them genuinely justifies it. My attorney made exactly this point when I talked to him. He said, never sign anything under same-day pressure. Always have it reviewed, and understand exactly what you're giving up in exchange for exactly what you're getting. That's the calculation. It's not ideological. It's contractual. What I gave up, in my case, was 30 days' pay. What I would have surrendered in exchange was the ability to respond when clients I had served for a decade picked up the phone. That was not a trade I was willing to make. Marcus graduated last May. I was there, same sun, both of us squinting. But this time I was there as someone who had built something of my own, rather than someone who had spent his career making someone else's firm valuable. He asked me once late in the process, when Jordan Consulting Group was starting to gain real traction, whether I was angry about how it had happened. I thought about it for a while before I answered him. I said, no, not anymore. What I was, I told him, was educated. 22 years taught me how to do the work. That Tuesday in March taught me who I was actually doing it for. The golf games with clients continued different course, different firm name on the logo items in the cart, but the same conversations, the same trust, the same relationships. The things that had always mattered, it turned out, were the things that traveled with me. They couldn't put a non-compete on those.